I came home earlier than planned that night, thinking I would surprise my husband. I tiptoed down the hallway, with my suitcase still rolling softly behind me, my heart oddly light, because I wanted to surprise my husband the way we used to surprise each other, back when life felt simpler. And I didn't ring the bell or use the key. I just pressed my thumb against the biometric lock, feeling that familiar cold surface recognize me instantly, the door opening with a muted click that sounded almost like a tired sigh, and the condo swallowed me whole in a hush so deep it felt intentional. The curtains drawn even though it was still early evening, the air thick with the lavender oil I always used, yet tangled with something sweeter, heavier, a scent that did not belong to me. And as I slipped off my heels, I was about to call his name when a sound drifted from the direction of the master bedroom. Not the television, not a phone call, but a woman's breath, uneven and broken, tangled with a man's low, strained breathing. And my body went rigid in the middle of the living room, as if the floor had hardened around my feet, my blood icing over before surging so violently I thought I might faint right there. And I remember thinking how strange it was that the first thing I felt wasn't tears, but an almost clinical clarity, like something inside me had already stepped back to observe the damage. If you're watching this video, please like and subscribe to my channel and let me know where you heard my revenge story in the comments. I want to know how far it has gone, and believe me, they deserve it. Let me explain why I'm in this situation. Let me tell you who I really am. I moved without sound, every step deliberate. My hand brushing the wall as I approached the bedroom door, left just barely ajar. A thin line of light slicing across the dark hallway, enough to show me the outline of our bed, the one I had made myself before leaving for my trip. The deep slate blue sheets pulled tight the way I like them, now twisted and ruined by two bodies pressed together with a familiarity that made my stomach turn. And when my eyes adjusted fully, I recognized the woman instantly, not a stranger, not some careless fling, but Lena, the wife of my husband's closest friend, the woman who had sat at my table, held my glass at dinner parties, laughed about our marriages like they were sister stories. And my husband's voice cut through me then, hoarse and eager, saying words that landed like knives I didn't see coming, murmuring that she felt alive, that she understood him, that being with me felt like being married to a schedule and a ledger instead of a woman. And Lena laughed softly, asking if he was scared I'd come home early. And he scoffed, saying I trusted him too much, that I always did, that I believed everything he said because I was too busy building a life to imagine he'd be tearing it apart behind my back. My ears rang so loudly, I barely heard myself. Inhale, my hand flying to my mouth to stop the sound that wanted to escape. 10 years of my life folding in on itself in that moment. 10 years of loyalty and compromise, and standing beside him when he doubted himself. And the word that echoed in my mind wasn't anger yet, it was foolish, because that was what he had reduced me to in his private vocabulary. And for one brief second, I wanted to push the door open, and let everything explode exactly where it stood. But something colder and sharper pulled me back. The part of me that had survived boardrooms and negotiations and quiet betrayals disguised as smiles. And with shaking hands, I reached into my jacket and turned on my phone, angling it through the narrow opening, counting my breath as I recorded just enough. Not everything, just enough truth to make denial impossible. 2 minutes that would sever the life I thought I had. And when it was done, I stepped away without a sound, lifted my suitcase, closed the door behind me gently, and walked out like a ghost who had already accepted she no longer belonged there. I don't remember the elevator ride or the lobby, only the way my body wouldn't stop trembling. Once I was in the back of the ride share, my teeth chattering like I was sick as I told the driver an address I knew by heart. Elena's place, my best friend, my attorney, the only person I trusted not to look at me with pity or tell me to calm down. And when she opened the door and saw my face, she didn't ask questions. She just pulled me inside. And when I showed her the video, she swore under her breath, her jaw tightening the way it did when she was preparing for a fight she intended to win, gripping my hand and telling me slowly, clearly, not to confront him, not to scream, not to destroy myself trying to destroy them. Because scenes cost women everything, and silence, when used correctly, costs men far more. And I listened because I knew she was right. Because I had built my entire adult life on knowing when to wait and when to strike. After a few hours, once the shaking eased into something numb and controllable, I fixed my makeup carefully, covering the swelling around my eyes, rehearsing the version of myself I needed to become. And when night fell, I went back, unlocking the door loudly this time, calling out his name with practiced warmth, watching him rush toward me in clean pajamas that couldn't hide the panic flickering behind his smile, asking why I hadn't called, telling me he missed me, hugging me while my skin crawled beneath his touch. And even as I smiled and answered him, my senses betrayed everything he'd tried to erase. The windows open, the air thick with freshener, and beneath it all, the unmistakable perfume Lena always wore, a gift I'd once helped him choose, now clinging to the man who shared my bed. And when I pulled away, claiming exhaustion, and saw the sheets had been changed to an old set I'd banished years ago, his clumsy lie about spilled coffee barely registering because I was already cataloging every detail, every misstep, every moment. He believed I was still the woman who trusted blindly. And that night, as he slept beside me, breathing easily, unaware that the marriage he thought he could manage was already over, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the hour when truth would move quietly through his phone and show me just how long he had been planning to live a life without me, while still standing in my shadow. I didn't confront him the next morning, or the morning after that, because something inside me had already shifted into a quieter, more dangerous place. The place where I listened instead of spoke. where I watched instead of reacted. And as the days passed, I began to notice the pattern I had ignored for months, finally arranging itself into something undeniable. Small changes first, harmless on the surface. The way he started taking his phone into the bathroom, the way notifications stopped lighting up his screen, even though he was clearly messaging someone. The way a name that used to come up casually in conversation disappeared completely, as if silence itself could erase a person. Lena stopped calling me altogether, which might have meant nothing if she hadn't suddenly started calling him for everything, asking for help with things she could easily have handled herself. Little favors dressed up as emergencies. And he always volunteered so quickly, it was almost reflexive, saying she was alone, that her husband was busy, that it was the decent thing to do. And I told myself I was being unreasonable because we'd all been friends for years, because I trusted my husband, because women like me are trained to believe doubt is a personal flaw instead of a warning sign. One afternoon, my friend Rosa was over, sitting at the kitchen counter with a glass of iced tea while we talked about nothing important. And when my husband walked through the room, Lena's name came up in passing, just casually, and I watched his shoulders tense for half a second before he relaxed again, a reaction so quick he probably didn't even notice it himself. But Rosa did, because she looked at me after he left the room and said quietly that something felt off, that Lena had always watched him too closely, that she straightened when he entered a room, laughed harder than necessary, leaned just a little too far into his space. And hearing someone else say what I had been burying made my chest tighten with a relief I didn't want, because it meant I wasn't imagining it anymore. That night, I mentioned it to him lightly, almost joking, repeating what Rosa had said as if it were gossip instead of a crack in our foundation. And he laughed too loudly, dismissed it too quickly, said Lena was dramatic with everyone, that I was overthinking things, that we were both tired and needed to stop inventing problems where there were none. And I wanted to believe him because believing was easier than accepting that the man I had built my life around might be slowly stepping out of it. But the unease didn't fade, it sharpened, especially when I noticed that while he barely texted me during the day anymore, his phone records showed constant activity, long threads that didn't belong to me or any of his known friends. And one night, when curiosity finally outweighed my shame, I opened his laptop and checked his messages, finding nothing. Every conversation scrubbed clean except the ordinary ones. And for a moment, I felt foolish and relieved at the same time, until I checked his email and saw the notification timestamped late at night, a private message received from Lena that no longer existed anywhere else, deleted so thoroughly it left a louder absence than any confession could have. From that point on, our marriage entered a different kind of rough patch. Not the familiar kind we had navigated before, but something colder, more distant, where he began framing our differences as incompatibilities instead of balance, saying things about me that had never bothered him in over a decade, things that mirrored Lena almost perfectly. The way she liked to go out, the music she loved, the spontaneity he suddenly claimed he needed, and When I asked him directly if he wanted to leave, he panicked, said he didn't know what he wanted, hovered in that space between staying and going like a man weighing options instead of honoring vows. And I realized with a sinking clarity that I was no longer his only anchor. I started watching more closely then, not obsessively, just enough to connect the dots, noticing how Lena rarely spoke to me anymore, but seemed intimately aware of his schedule. How she appeared in our neighborhood more often than made sense. How his explanations for his whereabouts grew vaguer as his defensiveness grew sharper. And when I checked the phone records again and saw him texting an unknown number while arguing with me in real time, my hands shook so badly I had to sit down, because that duplicity hurt more than the idea of an affair itself. I didn't confront him yet. I didn't call her. I didn't warn anyone, because I knew instinctively that questions would only teach them how to hide better. And instead, I began collecting the quiet truths, the timestamps, the contradictions, the way his stories shifted depending on who was asking. And I understood then that whatever had already happened between them was no longer innocent, because innocence doesn't require secrecy, and trust doesn't survive deletion. And as I lay awake beside him, night after night, listening to his breathing, I knew I was standing at the edge of something irreversible, something that would demand proof, not hope, and patience, not fear. And I told myself that when the truth finally surfaced, it would do so on my terms, not theirs. By the time I reached the point where sleep stopped coming naturally, I understood that whatever was happening between my husband and Lena was no longer something I could sense my way through. It was something I had to see, because intuition without proof only makes a woman doubt herself. And I had already wasted too much of my life questioning my own instincts. We worked opposite schedules, which meant he was home alone for long stretches of the day. And I noticed how defensive he became whenever I asked simple questions about his routine, how quickly he volunteered explanations I hadn't asked for. So one morning, almost casually, I opened the location sharing app on my phone, the one we'd both agreed to years earlier for convenience, never imagining I would one day use it like this, and watched the small dot that represented my husband begin to move in a direction that had nothing to do with the grocery store he claimed he was walking to. I didn't confront him right away. I sent a harmless text instead, asking how his day was going. And he replied a few minutes later, saying he was just wandering the neighborhood, thinking about us, the kind of message that would have melted my heart once, but now made my stomach tighten, because I could see him traveling miles away in real time, stopping at places that had nothing to do with reflection or reconciliation. And as the hours passed, I watched him move from cafe to cafe, from parking lot to quiet street, his dot lingering too long in places that required company. And every time I checked the phone records, there was nothing. No calls, no texts, which told me everything I needed to know about how he was communicating and with whom. By late afternoon, my hands were shaking so badly I had to put the phone down. But I kept watching anyway, because denial was no longer an option. And when he finally returned home, he texted me, apologizing for being distant, saying he'd spent the day thinking hard about our marriage. And I stared at that message for a long time before replying because there was something uniquely cruel about being lied to, so calmly, so convincingly, while I watched the truth unfold on a screen like a slow motion accident. That night, I asked him directly where he'd been. And when he repeated the same story about walking and thinking, something inside me snapped, just enough to let the words escape. Telling him I knew he was lying, that I knew exactly where he'd gone, and the color drained from his face in a way that confirmed everything before he ever opened his mouth. He admitted then that he'd seen Lena, minimized it immediately, said they'd only grabbed food, that it wasn't what it looked like, and I let him talk because liars reveal more when they think they're still negotiating the truth. And when I listed the things I knew, the deleted messages, the late night contact, the hours spent together while telling me he was alone, his resistance collapsed into something weaker, something closer to fear. And he finally said the words he'd been avoiding, that they'd gotten close, that they talked a lot, that it wasn't physical, as if emotional betrayal were somehow easier to forgive, as if secrecy didn't already define the boundary he'd crossed. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I asked him one simple question instead, telling him that if it were innocent, there would have been no lies, and he didn't argue, because there was nothing left to defend. And that was when I understood how far this had gone. Not because of what he admitted, but because of what he still tried to protect. And while he sat there struggling to explain himself, I sent a message to the one person who deserved the truth as much as I did, Lena's husband, telling him everything I knew without embellishment or emotion. And when he called me back later that night, his voice carried the weight of someone who had already sensed the betrayal, but hadn't wanted to name it. After that conversation, the air in our house changed completely. My husband moving through the rooms like someone waiting for a verdict, checking his phone constantly, flinching every time it lit up. And when a message finally came through, late that night, I saw it without touching the screen. Lena saying she was scared, that people were starting to notice, asking what they should do now. And I turned my back to him and closed my eyes, not because I wanted to escape, but because I knew then that the bond between them was already cracking under the weight of exposure. And fear has a way of turning lovers into liabilities. From that moment on, I stopped asking questions and started planning, understanding that the truth doesn't always arrive with a confrontation. Sometimes it surfaces when you give people enough rope to tangle themselves in their own lies. And as I lay awake, listening to my husband breathe beside me, I felt something settle into place. A calm that came from certainty rather than hope. Because whatever happened next would no longer be about discovering the truth. It would be about deciding how, when, and in front of whom it would finally come to light. I came home earlier than planned the day everything finally broke open. Not because I was trying to catch anyone, but because my body simply refused to stay where it was. As if some instinct, older than reason, was pulling me back toward the place where the lie lived. And I remember parking the car and sitting there for a moment longer than necessary, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, telling myself to breathe normally, to walk upstairs like a woman returning to her own life, instead of someone stepping into a scene she could no longer undo. I didn't text him. I didn't call. I moved quietly through the building, my shoes soft against the floor, my key already in my hand, before I decided not to use it, pressing my finger to the lock instead, and feeling it open with that same familiar sound that suddenly felt mocking, like the house itself had learned to keep secrets from me. Inside, the condo was dimmer than it should have been at that hour. Curtains pulled tight again, the air heavy, sweet, wrong. And before I could stop myself, I recognized the perfume immediately. Not a vague hint, but a confident presence. Lena's scent lingering in a space that belonged to my marriage. And I took off my shoes slowly, my heart beating so hard I was afraid it would give me away. When a sound reached me from down the hall, not laughter, not conversation, but the unmistakable rhythm of intimacy. A woman's breath breaking into soft gasps, a man's voice low and urgent, and I stood there frozen, my mind strangely calm as my body betrayed me, every nerve screaming at once. I moved toward the bedroom without thinking, each step deliberate, as if I were watching myself from a distance. The door cracked just enough to let a thin blade of light spill into the hallway, and through it, I saw what I already knew: my husband's body, pressed against another woman on the bed I had made before leaving that morning, the sheets twisted and bunched beneath them. And when she shifted and her face turned toward the door, there was no mistaking her. Lena's hair falling loose over her shoulders, her hands gripping him with a familiarity that told me this wasn't new. This wasn't a mistake. This was a continuation. My husband said something then, something small and intimate meant only for her, and she laughed quietly, asking if he was sure I wouldn't come back early, and he answered without hesitation, dismissive and confident, saying, I trusted him, that I always had, that I was predictable in the ways that mattered, and that was when the room seemed to tilt, not because of the betrayal itself, but because of the certainty in his voice, the comfort he had found in believing I would never interrupt the life he was building without me. I didn't rush in. I didn't speak. My hand found my phone almost automatically, the camera already open before I consciously decided to record, angling it through the narrow opening, capturing just enough, not for shock, not for revenge, but for truth. 2 minutes of undeniable reality that would outlast any explanation he might try to offer later. And as I watched them through the screen, I felt something detach inside me, a clean break, like a cord finally severed after being stretched too thin for too long. When it was done, I stepped back, my movements careful, controlled, lifting my bag, closing the door as gently as I had opened it, leaving the condo without a sound, walking past the elevator and down the stairs, because I needed to feel each step beneath me, to remind myself I was still standing. And once outside, the shaking started, my hands trembling so violently I could barely hold my phone, my breath coming in shallow pulls as if my body had waited until then to release what my mind had been holding together. I didn't go far. I went straight to Elena's place, the only person who would look at me and see clarity instead of chaos. And when she opened the door and saw my face, she didn't ask what happened. She just stepped aside and let me in. And when I showed her the video, she watched it once, then set the phone down carefully, her jaw tightening, her voice steady as she told me not to confront him, not to give him the relief of an emotional reaction, because scenes make women look unstable and men look forgiven. And I listened because by then I understood that whatever came next wasn't about my marriage anymore. It was about control. After a few hours, I went back, fixing my face in the mirror until it looked like exhaustion instead of devastation, unlocking the door loudly this time, calling his name as if nothing had changed. And when he rushed out of the bedroom in clean clothes with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, asking why I hadn't warned him, telling me he'd missed me, I let him hug me, standing still while the scent of her clung to his skin, while the lie settled between us like a living thing. And in that moment, as he spoke and I listened, I knew with absolute certainty that the woman who had walked into that condo earlier that day no longer existed, and the one standing there now was already planning how this story would end. I didn't sleep that night, even though he did, his breathing evening out beside me as if nothing fundamental had shifted, as if the house hadn't already split down the middle. And I lay there staring into the dark, letting the minutes pass until they lost meaning, listening to the soft hum of the city outside and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Each sound too sharp, too present. And when dawn finally crept in, I got up quietly and went about the morning the way I always had, making coffee, straightening the kitchen, moving through familiar motions that felt strangely distant, as though I were rehearsing a role I had already decided to abandon. He watched me carefully that morning, trying to read my face, and I gave him nothing, not warmth, not coldness, just normalcy. And that unsettled him more than anger ever could, because men like him rely on reaction to measure how much power they still hold. And when I moved past him without flinching, I saw the first crack of real fear settle behind his eyes. The condo smelled wrong in the daylight, layers of air freshener clashing with the perfume he hadn't managed to erase completely. And as I carried my mug toward the bedroom, I noticed how unnaturally tidy everything looked. The kind of order that only appears after something has been hastily hidden. And when I pulled back the covers, the pastel sheets stared back at me, cheap and unfamiliar, replacing the ones I had put on before my trip. And I asked him lightly why he'd changed them, keeping my voice even, almost amused. He hesitated, just long enough to betray himself, before launching into an explanation about spilling coffee, about not wanting to bother me, about meaning to fix it later. And I nodded as if I believed him, as smiling faintly, telling him it was fine, that accidents happened. And I watched relief wash over his face like a reward he hadn't earned, because lies become easier once they're accepted the first time. In the bathroom, I locked the door and turned the shower on full blast, not to cry, but to think, studying my reflection in the mirror, the woman staring back at me composed and distant, her eyes clearer than they'd been in years, and I understood then that whatever pain I was carrying had already been converted into something usable, something sharp. That night, he reached for me in bed, his hand tentative, searching, and I shifted away under the excuse of exhaustion, feeling my body reject his touch instinctively, and he withdrew without protest, rolling onto his side with a sigh that sounded almost offended, as if intimacy were something he was owed, regardless of where else he had spent it. And when his breathing deepened again, I waited, counting silently until I knew he was asleep, the room settling into a stillness that felt heavy with secrets. I moved slowly, carefully, turning toward him like a thief in my own home, the light from the nightstand casting a cold glow over his face as I lifted his hand and pressed his thumb to his phone, watching the screen unlock without resistance, and the calm that settled over me then surprised even myself, because this no longer felt like betrayal discovery. It felt like due diligence. I scrolled through the obvious apps first, finding nothing, conversations wiped clean, messages erased so thoroughly they looked curated. And instead of relief, I felt confirmation, because honesty leaves clutter and deception leaves polish. I went deeper into folders disguised as utilities, into apps that required passwords he assumed I would never guess. And when the screen finally opened at the right combination, I saw everything at once. Threads of messages stretching back further than I wanted to know. Images I didn't linger on. Words that made my stomach tighten. Not because they were explicit, but because they were intimate, in a way he hadn't been with me in years. And as I closed my eyes briefly and breathed through the nausea, I reminded myself why I was here, why I was looking, because truth doesn't soften when you avoid it. From there, it was a short step to his banking app, the one I had trusted him to manage because I believed partnership meant transparency. And the numbers that appeared felt heavier than any confession. Transfers labeled with careless endearments, amounts that didn't belong to impulse, gifts purchased with money he had called me we didn't have. And I remembered the nights he'd come home tense and distant, talking about cuts and delays and sacrifices we needed to make, while quietly financing a life that existed parallel to ours. I took screenshots of everything, working methodically, sending copies to myself, erasing any trace of access, before returning his phone to the nightstand, exactly where it had been. And when I lay back down, my body felt cold, as if I'd stepped out of a freezer instead of uncovering the financial skeleton of my marriage. The next morning, I cooked breakfast like I always did, setting the table, pouring coffee, listening to him talk about his plans for the day, and when I mentioned casually that I'd seen Lena's car near our building the day before, asking what she'd been doing in the area, his reaction was immediate and telling, the spoon slipping from his hand, his face draining of color as he scrambled for an explanation that landed poorly. And I smiled and nodded and let the silence stretch between us until it pressed down hard enough to make him uncomfortable. Because fear, once introduced, has a way of expanding on its own. From that point forward, I stopped reacting altogether and started observing, watching how carefully he chose his words, how often he checked his phone, how tense his body became whenever I picked mine up, and I understood that the trap didn't need to be sprung yet. It just needed to close slowly, because the more room you give guilt to breathe, the louder it becomes. And as I cleared the dishes and moved through the house that morning, I knew with quiet certainty that he was already unraveling and that I was no longer waiting to find out what he'd done. I was deciding how much of it the world would soon see. By the time I moved into what I thought of as the next phase, my emotions had gone almost completely silent, replaced by a steady focus that surprised even me. Because once you realize betrayal isn't just about bodies, but about money, planning becomes easier, almost inevitable. And I knew if I wanted to understand the full scope of what he'd done, I couldn't rush it. I had to let him believe he was still ahead of me. I started by changing nothing on the surface, still leaving early for work, still coming home tired, still listening when he talked about his day. But underneath that routine, I began following the trail he'd left behind, the one he assumed I would never think to look for, because for years I had trusted him to handle the details. One weekend evening, I cooked a more elaborate dinner than usual, opened a bottle of wine, created the kind of calm, familiar atmosphere that made him relax. And once I saw his shoulders drop and his voice loosen, I brought up money casually, mentioning a piece of land I'd seen outside the city, framing it as an opportunity. Nothing urgent, just something to think about. And the effect was immediate. His expression tightening, his glass pausing halfway to his lips, a flicker of panic flashing across his face before he tried to hide it, asking why I'd want to touch our savings now, why I wouldn't discuss something like that first. And I smiled softly, reminding him that I was discussing it, that it was our money, that I thought we should act quickly before someone else took advantage. The number I mentioned made his hand tremble, sweat beading at his hairline, despite the cool air in the room, and he began stalling, talking about markets and timing and risk, until finally he landed on an excuse so familiar it almost felt insulting, claiming he'd invested most of our savings and that the market had dipped, that selling now would mean a loss. And as he spoke, I watched him carefully, the way his eyes avoided mine, the way his words piled up too fast, and I nodded slowly, letting disappointment cross my face, telling him I wished he'd told me sooner, that it worried me, that I didn't like surprises when it came to money we'd earned together. Relief washed over him when I didn't push harder, when I didn't demand statements or access, and he reached for my hand, promising he'd fix it, promising transparency later. And I let him believe that lie too, because I already knew where the money had gone. I had seen the transfers, the jewelry charges, the quiet flow of our life into someone else's hands. And what mattered now wasn't exposing him yet. It was confirming how deep the deception ran. That night, while he slept, I spread the screenshots out on my phone like pieces of a map, cross-checking dates, matching withdrawals to the times he'd claimed work stress or financial strain. And I saw the pattern clearly then. Money leaving our accounts in steady increments, moving through accounts that didn't belong to him directly. Payments masked as expenses, loans, favors, all designed to keep me from noticing until it was too late. A few days later, I met with Elena again. This time, not as a woman in shock, but as someone assembling a case. And when I showed her what I'd found, her expression shifted from concern to something colder, more professional, explaining quietly that this went beyond infidelity, that moving marital funds without consent, especially for personal relationships, crossed legal lines, and that some of the transactions looked like they could raise serious questions at his workplace as well. And hearing that didn't scare me. It clarified things because it meant the damage he'd done was bigger than me and therefore harder for him to outrun. At home, he grew more anxious by the day, oscillating between excessive kindness and sudden irritability, watching me the way a gambler watches the table when he knows the odds have turned. And I fed that uncertainty deliberately, asking small, pointed questions, mentioning names and places I knew would unsettle him, watching his composure slip in tiny increments. Because guilt doesn't need accusations to surface, it only needs pressure. Every time I picked up my phone, his body tensed. Every time I came home late, he tried to mask his relief, and I understood that he was already living in fear, even before he knew exactly why. By then, I had stopped seeing him as my husband at all and started seeing him as a problem that needed resolution, not through shouting or confrontation, but through consequence. And as I lay in bed, listening to him turn restlessly beside me, I knew the money trail was only one part of what I would use, but it was the part that would hurt him most, because desire had driven him into secrecy, but greed had made him careless. And when those two collide, they leave evidence behind whether a man wants them to or not. By then, the house had become a waiting room, heavy with unsaid things, and I let that pressure work for me. Because people who are hiding something start unraveling when they believe the walls are listening, and I made sure they were. I stopped coming home at the same time each night, sometimes late enough to keep him pacing, sometimes early enough to catch him mid-excuse. And every small deviation tightened him a little more, his smiles becoming brittle, his questions sharper, his patience thinning in ways that revealed how little margin he had left. When I mentioned Lena casually, not accusing, just placing her name into ordinary conversation the way one might mention the weather, his body reacted before his words could catch up, shoulders stiffening, breath hitching, his denial arriving too fast, too practiced, and I filed each reaction away without comment, because silence makes fear echo louder than any confrontation. The tension spilled outward soon enough, because secrets never stay contained, and I saw it first in the way his phone became an extension of his hand, how he stepped into other rooms to answer messages, lowering his voice as if distance alone could erase what he was saying. And then in the way Lena began posting vague, restless thoughts online, fragments about pressure and exhaustion and not being seen, deleting them minutes later as if the internet could forget just because she wanted it to. I didn't react to any of it, but I watched, noting the timing, the overlap between her restlessness and his mood swings, understanding that whatever they had built together was starting to crack under its own weight. I added a little friction where it mattered most, speaking to him with exaggerated concern one evening about Lena, saying I'd run into her briefly and she'd seemed overwhelmed, mentioning offhand that she'd hinted someone was pushing her too hard, that she was scared of disappointing the wrong person. And the effect was immediate, his face draining of color, his hands restless, pacing the room as if trying to outrun a thought he didn't want to finish, and I said nothing more. Letting implication do the work, words would only cheapen. That night, he barely slept, turning over again and again, checking his phone in the dark, whispering in the bathroom with the water running, and I lay still, listening, understanding that fear was beginning to redirect itself. Not toward me, but toward her. At the same time, I let a rumor drift quietly into the spaces where it would travel fastest. Never directly accusing, never naming names, just expressing concern to the right people in the right tone, the way women do when they want to protect appearances while ensuring nothing stays buried. And within days, I felt the shift, subtle at first, then undeniable. The way conversations stopped when he entered a room, the way glances lingered a second too long, the way his name no longer moved freely through social spaces without resistance. He came home one evening smelling of alcohol, anger clinging to him like a second skin, complaining about gossip, about people who had nothing better to do than speculate, insisting loudly that if he'd done nothing wrong, he had nothing to fear. And I nodded sympathetically, telling him that was exactly right, that only guilt reacts to whispers, and I watched his jaw tighten as the meaning sank in. Lena reached out that same night, her message lighting up his screen with words I didn't need to read to understand, because the panic was visible even from a distance. And I knew then that the alliance between them was no longer built on desire, but on damage control, which is a fragile thing because when people start protecting themselves instead of each other, loyalty evaporates quickly. I could feel it shifting, the blame beginning to slide, the unspoken calculations taking shape, and I didn't interfere because collapse is most effective when it's self-inflicted. By the end of that week, the house felt smaller, his movements sharper, his patience gone, and Lena's presence in our lives reduced to a nervous shadow that hovered just out of reach. And I understood that I had reached the point of no return. Not because I planned to expose them yet, but because they were already doing it themselves, tearing at the seams of their own secret until nothing but panic remained. I didn't need to push anymore. I only needed to wait, because when fear replaces desire, people stop thinking clearly, and that is when they make the mistakes that end everything. The unraveling didn't come with shouting or slam doors. It arrived quietly, the way consequences often do, through a phone call he took in the kitchen, with his back turned to me, his voice low and strained, repeating the same phrases over and over, as if saying them enough times might make them true, insisting there had been a misunderstanding, that things had been taken out of context. And when he finally hung up, his hands were shaking so badly he had to sit down, his eyes avoiding mine with a desperation that told me exactly who had been on the other end of the line. He didn't explain. He didn't have to. I could see it settling into him, the realization that whatever shield he thought he had built was gone. That evening, he tried to talk. Not in the defensive tone he'd used before, but in the careful, measured way of someone attempting damage control, telling me we needed to be honest with each other. That stress had made him lose perspective, that lines had blurred without him realizing it, and listened without interrupting, letting him speak himself into smaller and smaller corners, because men confess more freely when they think they are negotiating forgiveness. When he finally admitted that his friend had called him, angry and confused, demanding answers he couldn't give without implicating himself, I felt the shift complete. The outside world finally pressing in on a secret that had survived too long in private. It happened faster after that. Lena stopped pretending. She showed up unannounced one afternoon while I was home, her face pale, her composure fractured, speaking too quickly, apologizing without naming what she was apologizing for. And when my husband entered the room and saw her standing there, the air tightened instantly. The three of us suspended in a moment that none of them could control anymore. Words tumbled out then. Not accusations at first, but fragments. Explanations layered over each other. Claims of loneliness and misunderstanding. Of boundaries crossed accidentally. And I let them talk, watching the way their stories failed to align. How each tried to step just far enough away from responsibility to leave the other standing closer to the fire. When I finally spoke, it wasn't loud or dramatic, just a simple statement of fact, telling them I had seen everything, heard enough, that I wasn't there to argue about definitions or intentions. And that was when the truth surfaced fully. Not because I demanded it, but because there was nowhere left to hide. Lena's voice breaking as she admitted how long it had been going on, how it had started small and grown into something neither of them could stop. And my husband standing there silent, his failure to contradict her louder than any confession. The confrontation ended without resolution, because by then, resolution was no longer mine to provide. And as Lena left, her shoulders hunched under the weight of exposure, my husband turned to me with something like panic in his eyes, asking what I was going to do. And I understood in that moment how completely the balance had shifted. How the man who once believed I would always wait, always forgive, was now standing in uncertainty, dependent on a woman he had already betrayed. I didn't answer him right away. I didn't need to. The truth was already moving outward, carried by conversations he couldn't intercept, by consequences he couldn't charm away. And as I watched him realize that control had slipped permanently from his hands, I knew that whatever came next would not be decided by emotion or impulse, but by the quiet, irreversible steps that follow when the truth finally stops being negotiable. By the time everything settled into what people like to call an ending, I understood there would be no moment that felt victorious. No scene where the balance tipped cleanly and satisfaction rushed in to replace the damage. Because real endings arrive without ceremony, through paperwork and silence and the gradual reassembly of a life that no longer includes the people who broke it. I didn't argue with him anymore after that day. I didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer explanations, because there was nothing left to clarify, only decisions to be made, and I made them quietly, starting with a call to Elena, then another to an accountant, then one more to a realtor. Each conversation moving a piece of my life out of reach of a man who had already proven he couldn't be trusted with it. He tried to talk his way back into relevance at first, oscillating between remorse and resentment, apologizing one moment and accusing me of being cold the next. as if my composure were another betrayal. And I let him speak until he realized his words no longer shaped my actions, that I had stepped out of the emotional economy he depended on. And when the papers were finally filed, he stared at them as if they were written in another language, asking me when I had decided this, and I told him the truth, that the decision had been made long before he noticed, the moment he believed I would never see him clearly again. The consequences unfolded without drama, his professional world tightening around him as questions arose he couldn't answer cleanly, relationships cooling where they once opened easily, invitations stopping, calls going unanswered, and I watched it all from a distance. Not with pleasure, but with a strange sense of completion, because I hadn't destroyed him. I had simply stopped protecting him from the results of his own choices. Lena disappeared from my life entirely, blocked everywhere without a word exchanged. Not because I needed the last line, but because silence felt more accurate than anything I could have said. And whatever remained between them dissolved under scrutiny neither of them had prepared for. I moved out shortly after, not in a rush, but with intention, taking only what belonged to me, leaving behind a house that no longer felt like shelter. And when I closed that door for the final time, there was no dramatic pause, no backward glance, just the understanding that some places are only meaningful while trust exists within them. My family stepped in without questions. My friends filled the spaces that had been emptied. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, my days began to expand again, no longer defined by vigilance or doubt, but by choices made freely and without fear. I didn't seek revenge, and I didn't wait for apologies, because neither would have given me what I wanted, which was not closure in the way people imagine it, but clarity. The kind that allows a woman to walk away without carrying the story as a burden. And as I rebuilt my life, piece by piece, I realized that the quiet strength I had relied on to survive this was the same strength that would carry me forward, unmarked by the need to prove anything to anyone who had already shown me who they were.